Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Chicanery. It is your host, Danny. So it is just me this week. Unfortunately, my fabulous co-host, JT, is heretofore unavailable, so you will just get to listen to me for circa 35 minutes. But it was both the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix and the Firestone Grand Prix at St. Petersburg. So there's a decent amount to get into, although we'll get into that a bit later. This race weekend didn't turn out to be quite as exciting on the IndyCar perspective as sort of initially anticipated. But again, we'll get to that. So first, we're going to start off chronologically, and that means that we will start with Formula One. So not going to touch too much on the free practice sessions, given that the sort of competitive running order has very much been revealed after Bahrain. There's not really a whole lot of point to get into it. There aren't too many insights, but what I did want to talk about was, of course, this was Ollie Bearman's debut. Of course, Carlos Sainz ended up missing qualifying in the race due to appendicitis, which required medical intervention, obviously, if you ever had your appendix removed. And I do find it interesting because Carlos ran the free practice sessions while dealing with the symptoms due to appendicitis, which I think is just absolutely mad, especially knowing what those drivers put their bodies through when they're in the car and perfectly healthy. But anyway, sort of moving on from that, of course, out of the cars that ran, the Alpines were effectively dead last. It was Ocon was 17th, Gasly was 18th. The only ones that were slower was Zhou Guan Yu, but that was because he had a massive accident in FP3 that red flagged the session, and the car wasn't rebuilt in time for him to make any laps. And then yet again, Logan Sargent was at the back of the grid. But those two, in some ways, almost don't count. Bottas was also out in Q1, making it a bit of a thud for the kick Saubers. But with that said, Bottas felt like traffic sort of screwed him out of a spot in Q2. And speaking of Q2, Nico Hülkenberg and Kevin Magnussen were very much doing a team thing, slipstreaming each other to try to give better runs, and Hulk slingshot Magnussen down the main straight in Q2, and then the car broke. And so he would end up not setting a time in Q2. And then the aforementioned Ferrari stand-in, Bearman, missed Q3 by just under 0.04 of a second, which is wild given the complete and utter lack of prep that he had going into the weekend. And as a result, he would take the flag. He would take 11th. Both Stroll and Tsunoda made it into Q3. For Stroll, this is only the second Q3 appearance in a run of like 12 races, which is kind of nuts. And Tsunoda out-qualified Daniel Ricciardo again. So Stroll and Tsunoda were P9 and P10, respectively. And Danny Rick qualified P14. As per usual, it was a Verstappen pole. Really not super surprising. But Leclerc and Perez would round out effectively the quote podium spots. Piastri out-qualified Norris, too, interestingly. And I mean, it was P5 and P6, so they occupied the third row of the grid together. But I do believe this is the first time that Piastri has out-qualified Norris. Certainly not in the context of a sprint race, because once you start doing the sprint seeding, Piastri has been ahead of Norris a few times. But those weekends, and given that the format has changed every year that the sprint has existed, there's been a format change. I still struggle for those to really count sort of in the grand scheme of things. But at any rate, kind of moving on to the race, the weekend only got worse for Alpine as Gasly's car just broke on the grid. On the formation lap, he had reported that there was a gearbox issue of some description, and then would end up retiring the car on lap 2 as a direct result of which. And speaking of start line shenanigans, both Norris and Perez jumped the start, granted in their own kind of funky little ways, but Lando had a big lurch forward and he jumped on the brakes. And then Perez had this really, really weird, like, rolling start of sorts, because there's a little thing. I don't know if it's like a stone or maybe that's like the bottom of a sensor, but you can see it on the tire because it's upright on the onboard at the start. And then you can see it just start creeping forward, like right before the lights go out. And, you know, it's kind of interesting. Of course, it's an electronic control line, which is what dictates the jump start. The stewards can see this and, you know, look at that. Then they can add a bit of context as to if it constitutes a true jump start. Now, I don't ever recall Sergio's at any point being noted at all by the stewards. Lando's was, though. It was about midway through the first stint, and we'll get to the steward stuff here in a bit. But it was about midway through the first stint that Lando was investigated, and there was, you know, no further action taken. To be fair, he jumped on the brakes, I guess, when he kind of saw what was happening, and you can argue he didn't get an advantage, but I know a lot of people sounded off about that one. But at any rate, so both 2 jump starters effectively, and no penalties for their troubles. So good on them, I guess. A little bit later on, it was lap 6 at turn 23, because Jeddah has a million, bazillion, tillion corners. Stroll stuffed it in the barriers. And it's so funny. I don't know. It was a weird bit of lack of information / miscommunication on the pit wall, because Stroll's race engineer had asked him, okay, well, you know, bring the car back. You know, I guess maybe they just thought he'd broken the front wing. And then he was basically like, well, I've put it in the barrier, so that won't be happening. It was a very funny, very kind of terse interaction that you really don't see much from Stroll. Generally speaking, he's pretty quiet, both inside and out of the car. And so to see him get a bit chippy is, as unusual as it is, kind of amusing, if I'm being perfectly honest. But regardless, is that this would bring out the safety car, because the car needed to be retrieved from the barriers. And this would cause a whole bunch of folks to dip into the pits for hards. Basically everybody who pitted for hards, to try and turn this into a one-stopper. Now, interestingly enough, you did have folks that actively chose to stay out. Lando, Lewis, Nico, and Zhou Guanyu all stayed. They all stayed out. I know some of that was to avoid double boxing, which can cause some issues. The pit lane in Jeddah, I know, is a little bit tight. And yeah, so they stayed out for a while, and it's funny because when after pit cycles go and kind of everybody filtered through, because Lando and Lewis at one point were 1-2 because they stayed out. Now Lando would jump into the pits not too long thereafter. Lewis would stay out for another 20 some odd laps, because if I recall correctly, he didn't end up pitting until like lap 37 or so. But even Lewis on his original and, you know, aging medium tires, he battled with Oscar Piastri for, I guess it would have been P6 for a considerable amount of time. Even though I do believe overall, I think the McLaren is probably the faster car out of the two right now, which is super embarrassing that the customer team is currently quicker than the works team, but we're going to get to that in a second. But yeah, it's just, it really does, I think that those kind of drives goes to prove why Lewis is so highly rated amongst certainly all those in the paddock. It's because you got a slow Mercedes on old tires holding off the quicker McLaren, which is super impressive. But anyway, back to stewards things. Yeah, they were busy actually during the end of that safety car period. Perez got a 5-second penalty for an unsafe release, although that wouldn't end up mattering at all in the end. And then K-Mag was on demon time. Here it was kind of nuts. 10 seconds for going off track and basically passing Yuki off track. So it was a 10-second penalty for gaining an advantage. And then another 10 seconds for causing a collision with Albon when Albon was trying to overtake. And there was a reason for all of this, well, sorry for the pun, but all of this chicanery on a part of K-Mag. So it was basically, it became Project Protect Hulk. Which, of course, when you conjure up the mental image, you think, okay, well, why would the Hulk need protecting? But anyway, bad comic book puns aside, basically, Hulk was in a position to gain a point, but they needed to protect him so that he didn't lose all of the time that he, basically all the time in the spots that he had picked up in pit cycles. And so basically K-Mag played rear gunner effectively, going, you shall not pass. Photoshop a photo of K-Mag's face on the body of Gandalf. But yeah, and he just didn't let him go. And I mean, to be fair, he did a brilliant job at defending. Granted the going off track to gain the spot, but that's not great. But certainly the defending was robust. So much so that even Albon didn't seem too upset that he had effectively been driven into by K-Mag for the sake of in this battle. So hey ho. However, RB, Racing Bulls, V-Carb, I still don't know what I'm going to call this stupid team. But point is that the Red Bull Junior team, the senior staff, Laurent Mekies and Alan Permane, were not super thrilled about the Magnussen train. Yeah, Alan Permane and Lawrence Mekies called the driving unsportsmanlike. I do believe that was a quote specifically from Permane, but Mekies said that he was going to, the junior team was going to talk to the FIA about perhaps effectively banning this type of driving and defending in future. I guess the fear being is that was going to set potentially kind of a yucky precedent with drivers doing very silly things to help their teammates, or I guess at the very least more silly than they already do. But certainly it was kind of amusing to watch, and I mean, helped his teammate score a point. And even after all the penalties, he only lost one spot because he was on the road. P11 finished P12. So now, granted, you say what you will about it potentially being an indictment on how poor the racing is generally in Formula One, or kind of has always been, is that 20 seconds only means one spot. After all of that is taken into account. But at any rate, that is a debate for another day. So it was, of course, another Red Bull 1-2. It was Verstappen finishing on the road about 5 seconds ahead of Perez. Now it's worth noting that Perez himself had a 5-second penalty. Once again, it ended up not mattering. He still retained P2. Charles Leclerc came home in third. But probably the most fun bit of all of this was that Bearman scored points on debut, P7. Which is kind of wild for a guy who was thrown in, well, basically he had, prior to the weekend, no experience in a Formula One car. And even on the weekend, he basically got drafted in ahead of qualifying. And so to end up almost making it to Q3 and then to go on and score, decent points is kind of insane. So I am super excited, that hopefully he'll get a race seat going forward. The likes of him, Poucher, Lawson, all of these kids are, they're gunning for spots. Now, we've talked about it time and time again on this show. 2025 is a big contract year. Lewis has already kind of knocked over the first domino. And but we'll have to see, who's on the grid, who's not, and to see if we can maybe make some space for these young guns to finally get the drives that, truth be told, they desperately, desperately deserve, I think. But anyhow, speaking of Ferrari, after post-race, team principal Fred Vasseur said that there was no official or established timeline for Carlos Sainz's return to the car. Fred said something to the effect of, and I am paraphrasing here a bit, that Carlos is an adult and he should be able to figure out what the right time is to be back in the car. So I figure, especially given that we have a week break between Jeddah, or I guess an additional week, between Jeddah and Albert Park, that he'll probably be back in time for the Australian Grand Prix. So we'll have to see. I can imagine Carlos will want to be back in the car for Australia. Certainly doctor's orders and so on and so forth. I've never had appendicitis, and actually, amazingly, I've never had friends that have had appendicitis, so I don't really know what the recovery time is for that and how long it takes. Carlos is certainly a very fit guy, so I imagine he would probably need less time to recover than, me, certainly. But, I don't know. But the other big thing from the weekend is, yet again, more mixed signals coming from Mercedes. Now, certainly, if you'll rewind your brain back, 3 weeks now, to preseason testing, and then rewind that back 2 weeks to Bahrain. Mercedes said that certainly the pace and the amount of pace that they had and the way the car behaved was all on track in the real world, was largely indicative of how the simulation data suggested that the car should indeed behave. And so the car has been, basically kind of third row of the grid type car so far this season, which, truth be told, really isn't a huge improvement over last year. Actually, I would argue it's not at all. If anything, there is the argument to be made that the car seems like start of every season it gets a little bit slower. But anyway, that's not the point. The point being is that, it's like I said, third row of the grid type car is kind of where it seems to be. Well, interestingly enough, Toto said post-Jeddah that Mercedes was actually struggling, and that the reality is that there was actually a big gulf in sort of simulation data and the car's pace and where the car should be fast or slow and so on and so forth, as opposed to where it was in the real world, which is very, very odd, like I said, given that it's directly contradictory to the statements that the technical staff made at Bahrain, for all intents and purposes, circa a month ago. So that's very, very puzzling that this team can just, at least in this current rule set, cannot figure out they just can't figure out this rule set. They can't seem to get a grasp on it at all. And I find that to be borderline stupefying. It's like you had a car concept, you thought it wasn't working, you thought you figured it out, but then that turned out to be a false dawn. You build effectively as close as you're going to get to a B-spec car given the current budget cap. Because let's be clear, the W14, the updated car, was not a true B-spec. Because the chassis, all of the hard points on that car were the same, as is dictated in part by the development freeze and then in part by the budget cap. And then, they get the opportunity in the off-season to go ahead and then basically completely rework the car concept, and in something honestly more in the vein, well, frankly, of Red Bull. I mean, because that is the meta, let's be clear. It's not, by no means am I accusing them of copying, and making a black, Red Bull, a la the Tracing Point memes of 2020. But it's wild that it's like they have gone back and forth and cannot figure it out. To echo some of the sentiments I've been seeing on socials this week, it is wild to think that this team got 8 consecutive constructors titles, and they are just this sodding disorganized. I personally don't understand it at all. But, and it's like, to make matters worse, Toto, with kind of a wink and a nod the other day, was talking about how they were going to do funny things with, simulation data, trying to figure out race setup for the Australian Grand Prix, and that, maybe in the practice setups they might do some funky things. Basically, they were going to try weirdness in service of finding pace. And, again, same thing, Toto's doing the wink, wink, nudge, nudge meme. But it's, in actuality, it's borderline horrifying that this team is, for a third year in a row is just this goddamn disorganized. I don't understand it, and I don't think anybody really does. And it's feeling more and more like it's going to be time to gut. I think it's time to gut the technical staff of Mercedes and just start over. It's kind of like a rebuild in sports where, the dynasty has fallen. Time to, gut it, tank and, just start again. But anyway, moving on, we have the Firestone Grand Prix at St. Petersburg. That's right, folks. IndyCar is back. Woot woot. Now, unfortunately, this actually really wasn't a terribly interesting race, so this recap is actually going to be kind of quick, especially given that I don't have my wonderful co-host to sort of bounce off of for this section. But first, a word from our sponsor, Home Field Apparel. Home Field has entered the thrilling world of motorsports with the Hendrick Motorsport Collection, which is available to pre-order now. Based out of Indianapolis, you likely already know Home Field for their high-quality, officially licensed collegiate apparel. You probably also know that they have more than 180 schools on their roster, so there's a little something for everyone. I mean, seriously, they even have my local Division II school, Wayne State University. Given Home Field's storied legacy and throwback college apparel and their relentless commitment to quality, moving to racing apparel seemed like the next logical step, and that's reaffirmed in their meticulous approach to designing the Hendrick Motorsport Collection. Iconic logos, legendary drivers, and unforgettable moments, this collection is a celebration of the golden era of NASCAR. Here at Victory Lane Vibes, we're super excited to get our hands on what Home Field has cooked up. Their collegiate wear is second to none, and in concert with some of the most legendary drivers and one of the most legendary teams in NASCAR history, the Hendrick Motorsports Collection is a banger. To learn more, visit www.homefieldapparel.com. Their online storefront is easy and convenient to navigate, making it that much easier for you to proudly represent your favorite drivers and relive NASCAR's glory days. And be sure to use promo code VLV24 for 15% off at checkout on your first order. Again, the Hendrick Motorsport Collection is available to pre-order now. Use promo code VLV24 for 15% off at checkout on your first order. And thanks again to Home Field Apparel for supporting this podcast. At any rate, certainly for quali, Newgarden was on pole. He was a little under 6,000, I think. Ahead of, no, it was 6/10,000, I'm sorry. Ahead of Felix Rosenqvist, who recently made the jump to Meyer Shank from Aero McLaren, which is such a small margin. But it's worth noting that, just as the general competitiveness of Indy cars, that all of the Fast Six are kind of there and thereabouts. But at any rate, the race got off to a pretty quiet start. There was very aggressive fuel saving, not much really in the way of happenings. Of course, you remember last year, there was that lengthy red flag period after, like, half the grid felt like stuffed it into the barriers at turn 1, or tire bundle, actually, because that's what that is. But we didn't have a big initial melee on lap 1, and everybody got away reasonably scot-free. Now, granted, Christian Lundgaard and Alex Palou got together at turn 1, which got Lundgaard with a puncture, in which he had to pit for, which dropped him down the order. And even despite them trying some kind of funky things with strategy, he never really recovered, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. But yeah, it was just super duper quiet. It wasn't until lap 27 at turn 10 that Marcus Armstrong put it in the barriers, which brought out the first caution of the day. Marcus called it a costly mistake, which I think is fair. But, and then same thing, of course, this caused a flurry of pit cycles. And Joseph Newgarden, who had been leading, dominating even, up to that point, got shuffled down to P5, sorry. Now, and part of that is because Lundgaard, who had pitted earlier because of a puncture, decided to stay out for track position, and he led a few laps, and would do so until lap 35, where Sting Ray Robb fell off the track. And then Lundgaard pitted, and same, like I said earlier, he just never was able to really regain the track position, ended up finishing P20, for a little bit of context sake. And Newgarden retook the lead. Now, Marcus Ericsson would retire on lap 50 due to a lack of power. And then Linus Lundqvist would get punted by Grosjean at lap 69. Nice. And turn 10. Grosjean was given a drive-through penalty for it. And then, to be fair, he actually did accept responsibility. Now, it's worth noting that Lundqvist was kind of spicy in the interview, the post-crash interview, talking about, well, this is what happens, I guess, for being ahead of Grosjean on track, which was like, ooh. But yeah, so drive-through penalty on shortly thereafter. And then on lap 85, Grosjean's car would just break entirely, suffering seemingly a similar mechanical issue to what took out Ericsson. And it's a shame because Grosjean had qualified P6, I do believe. And so he was on for a pretty decent day on his maiden outing with Juncos Hollinger Racing. But it just never... Yeah, it was just that the crash and then the car breaking shortly thereafter just really sealed it. Now, Newgarden, particularly after this final caution, he would just check out and win. And it very much became a battle for second amongst Scott McLaughlin, Will Power, and Pato O'Ward. And it would end up finishing a Penske 1-3-4 with Pato spoiling the Penske podium sweep. And it's so funny because I posited on the podcast account right before St. Pete if Newgarden was going to basically pull a Matt Campbell, who he co-drove with in the Porsche Penske number 6 at Daytona, the car that won overall. If basically he was going to do another race and dominate in the same way that Matt Campbell went to Bathurst with the Montai Racing Porsche GT outfit and won that race. And the answer to that question was very, very much, very emphatically a yes. So, it's, yeah, I don't know. It's just apparently there was a little bit of fairy dust in the number 6 that basically everything that those drivers have touched is more or less turned to gold. We'll ignore some of the issues at Qatar with the number 6. But even then, that car still qualified on the GTP pole, so there's that. Or, sorry, LMDH, wrong series. But anyway, yeah, so that was effectively the race. It was, like I said, kind of a quiet one. Now, Alex Palou and Alex Rossi would have kind of similarly quiet, but very productive days. Palou started 13th, finished P6, which is interesting. We'll get on, it's not only the first race of the season, but championship implications are always fun, so I will indulge myself for a minute, since I don't have anybody to tell me no this week. And Alex Rossi finished P8 starting P15. And Callum Illot, who, we've spilled lots of ink about the way he was royally screwed at Juncos. And he's basically filled in at McLaren for an injured David Malukas. He would go on to finish P13. So not a bad day. From what I understand, no word on when Lil Dave... Can we still call him that? I don't know. But no point on when David'll be back in the car. But anyway, back to my championship implications. It's interesting because the worst finish of the season for Palou on his championship run last year and actually the year prior was at St. Pete, and it was the same thing. That was a P8 finish. But interestingly enough, both of Newgarden's championships were basically, he won those when he won at St. Pete. So I don't know. I think this is interesting. You have the guy, who has dominated IndyCar the last little bit, and then the guy who, recently won the Indy 500 last year, and then is coming off of a 24 Hours of Daytona win, almost at Daytona 500. that is the wrong podcast. Like I said, both of his championships started with him winning the season opener at St. Pete. So I don't know if this is anything to go by. Then this could turn into kind of a slugfest of a championship. It was kind of a snoozer last year, comparatively speaking. Scott Dixon tried to rescue it at the end, going on a bit of a tear, but ultimately that was just delaying the inevitable. Insert Agent Smith monologue here at the end of the final Matrix movie. But yeah, so like I said, it's kind of a quiet race for IndyCar this year. So we'll see what happens. Next on the round is Thermal Club, which is basically effectively IndyCar's all-star race. So we'll see that. But more pressingly, I don't know when this episode is going to end up being out, but either basically the following day, or it will have just happened like a day or two prior, will be the 12 hours of Sebring. Super excited. We've got all of the GM cars, so the Cadillac, one of the Cadillacs, and both Corvettes, both factory Corvettes, are painted gold. We have the IMSA debut of the Lamborghini, the SC63 V8. We've got some fun stuff going on, so I am genuinely kind of hyped for the race, and we'll have to see how that goes. But at any rate, thank you all so much for listening. I am Danny, your host, and this has been another episode of Chicanery. Until next time.